premise of my lecture is that if you've read Jane Eyre, or if you've at all been familiar with some version of a movie of it, you will more or less find St. John to be a jerk. Is that more or less true for most of you? Like, St. John is kind of more or less, if not a jerk, vaguely repulsive. Like, not somebody you want to hang out with. So here are the reasons, more or less, why we think he's a jerk, just in case you've forgotten. He seems repressed. Yes? I have this passionate love for Rosamond that I cannot express, but I tremble in her presence. He seems to take all of his emotions and to say that they're not worthwhile or valuable and to just push them to one side. He's very cold. He calls himself cold. Jane finds him freezing. At one point she says, "You are cold, but I am hot, and fire melts ice and makes it drip." And he says, "It's your dripping that's making me stay." Anyways, there really is a moment in the book where they do that. But he's cold. It's very difficult to warm up to a character in any novel that's cold, is it not? He's not the first cold person that you've met in the book, but he's the person whose principal characteristic is cold, so it's quite elevated, quite a big part of how he's presented. He's also despotic and controlling. He threatens Jane with hell. That doesn't usually endear someone to you. He almost always views people, including himself, as a means for a purpose, yeah? And not someone with, affections and feelings that maybe should be considered. That we often find that, kind of repulsive. We tend to think about it in the other direction, that the most important thing to do with someone is to go, yeah, I feel that with them. And he's just really the opposite. He is not very indulgent of feelings. So not only does he forget that people have them, but when he realizes that they do, he kind of thinks that they should stop. So that makes us rather think he's a jerk. And finally, he, while a person of great conversation, of a fine mind, good manners, great dress, very handsome, which Jane recounts at length to Mr. Rochester, even though all those things are true about him, he ruins Christmas. When Jane is preparing, he doesn't really ruin Christmas, but I'd like to put it that way. When Jane is preparing Morehouse, I think it is, Morehouse in Marsh End, for Christmas and decking it out and rubbing it down and making it beautiful and putting fires in every hearth and making it this homey, wonderful place, he's profoundly uncomfortable and wishes it would all stop. And she's like, "It's Christmas, we're gonna have the best Christmas ever." And he's like, "I can't wait till the new year. Please somebody call me out in the cold so I can go minister to a sick person." And he's much happier when he's done that and comes back having exerted himself. And we think this is odd because more or less, we like Christmas. And he sounds like the Grinch. So that's more or less why we tend to think he's a bit of a jerk and a bit repulsive. But there are a few problems. The principal problem is one that Dr. Reynolds, the founder of our program, made me think of about 5 years ago when he pointed out that the novel ends with him, that he in fact gets the last word. Unlike Mr. Brocklehurst, Georgiana, Mrs. Reed, all these other people who you also really dislike in the novel, St. John somehow ends up with 2 paragraphs, not just one, not just a sentence, but 2 paragraphs at the very end, maybe 2.5 because of that last paragraph, it's just one line. He ends up with that at the very end, and there's a note of triumph in his final words, and we'll get to that, I hope, towards the end there. There's a note of triumph, and it seems an odd check to Jane's fulfillment and happiness. It's this very kind of odd moment. So in one sense, you have to account for the fact that after a whole book, basically in which Jane is not supposed to end up with someone like St. John or go across with his purposes, a whole book that has led you to the point where Jane is fulfilled with happiness and meaning in family life, to wonder what is going on when the book ends with missionary triumph. someone who didn't choose the life of domestic comfort. This is why he hates Christmas, or hates the domestic comforts attached to Christmas. He didn't choose that life. He chose a life of exertion, but also a life of triumph. And that's curious. It makes me pause. It makes me think that I can't just think that he's kind of repulsive and cold and a jerk. It makes me think I have to look back and say, okay, what about him prepares the ground such that either Brontë had to account for him or she chose to. So either there's something about who he is and what he does and his purpose in the novel that meant that she had to sort of like tie the end, like stick the landing, as it were, with him. She had to do that, or in some ways there's a tension in the novel that she has to continue to represent even at the very end. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'm wanting to account for him, at first because of the end, second of all, because of who he isn't. He is not Brocklehurst. Both Brocklehurst, the Reverend Brocklehurst, is he a reverend or is he just a jerk? Is he a reverend jerk? I can't remember. I think he's a reverend. Brocklehurst and St. John both threaten Jane with hell, right? Brocklehurst says, liars go to hell, and inside Jane is thinking, deceit is not my fault, covered. And she says, therefore I must take care not to die. In some ways, she completely rejects his attempt to manipulate her with hell because she knows that the accusation that is supposed to be founding that problem has no substance. She knows that she is not deceitful, in fact. And she also has already begun to pick up on the fact that Brocklehurst is a total hypocrite, right? He expects the girls at Lowood School to attain to a level of spiritual asceticism that his own daughters don't even come close to. So he cuts their hair, but his daughter's hair is all like fashionable and beautiful. He makes them wear bad clothes and gives them bad needles to sew their own clothes with, but his daughters are decked, right? He just doesn't actually believe that what he's doing to these girls is best, is suited to human nature. He thinks it's only for them because they're poor and unconnected. So he's a hypocrite. He's also, St. John is not like that, in part because when St. John is saying to Jane, if you don't marry me, you're in danger of going to hell, kind of extreme, we think. When he's saying that, he legitimately believes, sincerely believes, that God has a call on her life and that marrying him and going to India is precisely that call. And if she chooses not to do that, it's not so much that she's disobeying God and that's it. It's that she's made a movement in her soul towards personal comfort and earthly happiness and perhaps sensuality and all the degradations that might come with it in subtle middle-class ways that he thinks is deathly dangerous to her soul. And he's worried about this. He's worried about this, and he prays earnestly for her soul. He legitimately fears hell, whereas Brocklehurst doesn't fear hell. He only uses the threat of hell as a means to control. You see the difference? They're the same move. One comes from the hypocrite, but one comes from the sincere Christian. Whether or not he's he is mistaken about that after all, but he does not know that at the time. So he's not a Brocklehurst, but he's also not an Eliza, who is perhaps the second most scary person in the book, Eliza being the cousin who goes off and becomes a mother superior of a convent. A little Catholic dig there, which is kind of mean of Brontë. But Eliza is the person who sort of takes her sister down, remember? And she takes Georgiana down from being this little sensualist and always being driven. And Eliza makes this kind of horrifying claim for the rule of reason that makes you think that reason is actually probably the worst way to live your life. Eliza says that if you want to be independent, divide your day into increments of 5 minutes and make sure you assign a task to every 5 minutes, and that way you'll get through the whole of your day, independent of any person whatsoever, and it's all been rationally ordered. And she joins the convent not because she's truly persuaded of Catholic doctrine, although she says, I think I will be. She joins the convent not because she wants to live for Jesus. That's really not on the table at all. She joins the convent because they live a regular life. Everything is in due order. It is orderly and predictable and independent. And that's what she wants. He is not like that. Reason holds the reins for him, but not like that. Not in a way that is meant to completely isolate from human communion. Not in a way that is meant to reinforce a kind of horrifying pride and self-isolation. Does that make sense? He doesn't want to be alone because he is that awesome. Right? He wants to impact the world because he is that awesome. Because he has faculties that really are that awesome and that are restless until they get exercise. So he's not an Eliza and he's not a Brocklehurst. Those are jerks, truly. In the story. They are people that you're not really meant to sympathize with at all. And Eliza and Georgiana both get dismissed pretty much right after Mrs. Reed dies as, this is the last time I wish to talk about them. And they don't even feature in the epilogue at all. So he's neither of those. So those are things to remember as you're thinking about, well, what is he? Well, what he's not is the first place you can start. What he's not is a hypocrite. What he isn't is someone for whom an adulation or a purported adulation of reason is actually a way to reinforce a self-isolating, horrific, Achilles-like pride. He's neither of those two. Other points of curiosity. And this is the part where I'm tempted to just go on and on and on because there are so many. He is so like Rochester. It is insane how many points of connection there are between him and Rochester. They are both despotic people. They are both inclined to tyrannize Jane and to, in some sense, attempt to make her their slave. Rochester does this through affection and benefaction. And Jane feels this from the moment that their engagement commences, or maybe the next day their engagement commences, when he shuffles her off to Millcote to go buy pretty-like things. Over and over again, she finds his attention, his beneficence, his wanting to buy, to deck, to bestow, to otherwise make her look awesome and beautiful in the eyes of the world. She finds it oppressive and degrading. She finds it in a way that's a fashion of being treated like a mistress, even though she knows that he wants her to be his wife. And the last thing a governess who's about to marry her employer wants to feel is that she might kind of, be regarded by him as a plaything that is bought. So she knows he loves him, but she really dislikes this habit of his. And he says at one point, oh, it's better to have you than to have a whole harem of ladies. And she says, I am not even in that category. If you wanted that kind of thing, why don't you go down to Morocco and go to Istanbul and go buy yourself something? And he said, but what will you do then? And then she says something very interesting. She says, I will become a missionary and preach liberty to your harem. And I will force you to sign the most liberal charter that any despot ever has. So already there's a sense in which she recognizes that some of the way that he understands how to make her part of his life and what he expects out of their marriage has a tendency towards a tyrannical despotism that no matter how much he says that she is her equal and really believes it, treats her like a hired subordinate. And that is a marriage that she does not want. Similarly, she has to resist throughout their engagement his passion, his ardor, leading them into what she calls a bathos of sentiment, which I think we're supposed to also read as forbidden eroticism, right? It's not something that she doesn't want. She's passionately in love with him. She wants to be one with him, but she doesn't want that to take over their life, neither as an engaged couple nor as a married couple. And he keeps threatening that she will make him totally his at a certain date, soon coming along. And she says something like, no, I'm pretty sure that if this expedient works, I can always think of another. So she looks at that period in her engagement when she is controlling, when she's setting boundaries and limits to how much his passion is going to dictate how they relate to each other. She anticipates continuing into their marriage. So he is despotic and tyrannical with respect to her. He says he wants to pull her into himself and almost engulf her existence into his. And he thinks of their relationship as one in which she's his good angel. He says that to her, right? But she's a good angel that is really just for him. It's a weird form of lack of mutuality. He wants to give and give and give, but the things he wants to give tend to be more material things, yeah? And he will receive from her sort of spiritual things, reformation. And when he says things like that, she says, you know what? I'm no angel. I am a woman, and you should expect that from me. And she also says later, you can't expect reformation from a human being. You can only expect that from God. Basically, stand on your own 2 feet, man. So it's interesting that he's a tyrant and he's despotic, but his tyranny is precisely one that is a weird form of dependence. So she can play it, she can control it, she can manipulate it, but she's very aware that she doesn't want to be made a slave. And later on, when she's thinking about what if I had married, what if I had gone off with him, what if we'd gone to Marseille, she calls that a slave, being a slave in a fool's paradise. She rightly sees that to go off with him and become a woman who is in every way his partner for life, but not his wife, would never to be a marriage. It would be to be a slave. It would be to be a slave who would be at one point lost in bliss, but in the middle of the night racked with regrets and tears. It would be a way to lose half herself in that sense. So she desires an independence from him, from his despotism. And St. John, I think I don't have to say too much about St. John's despotism. It says directly, he was despotic. How do I prove this? It says it. Second of all, he's clearly a very controlling person. Once St. John has figured out what he thinks it is right, what reason or God has called him to do, he is merciless in pursuing it. He has no cares about anything else once he thinks it's the right thing to do. In that sense, he's just as despotic. And because he is a hard man and also despotism is also a vice in him, he sometimes mistakes the dictates of himself for the dictates of reason. And that's pretty clear in the book, too. That's one of his primary faults. So he's despotic. Both of them, like any despot, really dislike it when you resist them. Yeah, so Rochester is really irritated they're not their whole engagement, but he's also kind of charmed. She says that I kept him rather crusty on the whole, but I could see that he was excellently entertained. So he really dislikes resistance, and in the part where she's basically saying, I'm really not going to be your mistress, she has to hedge it quite a lot to manage his abhorrence for that kind of resistance. And she says, I hated to press him, to push him with the resistance that he so abhorred. And the times in that confrontation between the two of them that he is most out of control is when she is resisting. When she is most threatened is when she is most directly resisting. So you'll see her sort of walk towards the line of saying, no, I will not, and then try to cushion and help him to calm down. But he detests it so much that he threatens her with a form of rape. Right? If you don't listen to reason, I will try violence, is what he says, which is possibly one of the most miserable forms of rape because she actually loves him. But he does that when her resistance, which he so abhors, pushes him. Is it her fault? No, I'm not saying it's her fault. I'm saying, however, that his abhorrence for resistance is so strong, it drives him to horrible, vicious, desperate measures. Right? That something in his character is that strongly desiring of a certain kind of mastery or control or dominance. He's an energetic man, a manly man. He likes to get things done, sort of, except for like anybody but himself. I'm not really into Rochester today. Sometimes I'm like, oh, he's so sad, but now I'm like, what a jerk. Yeah, they both are despotic. They both abhor resistance. St. John actually gets, when he really detects a proper resistance to what he thinks is good and right, he assigns it a moral value. And it's very bitter to him. Very, very bitter to him. Very similar. They both, to some degree, threaten to possess her against either her will or her inclination. So Rochester does it when he threatens rape. St. John does it when he says, when she rightly apprehends that they would go through all the forms of love in a marriage that was absent of sentiment. So there's a sense of being possessed against her will there, which is not too dissimilar to what she experienced with Rochester. That's scary. They both seem to agree that what marriage is the drawing in of the wife to the husband such that she is lost or submerged in him. Rochester says this multiple times, that he wants to make her a part of him, that she's going to be fully his, that he will grasp her to him forever. It's always a him kind of holding together, that he's going to pull her. That when she says, I must part with you, he says, you mean you must become a part of me? Yes, yes, I know. Right? It's not we're going to become a part of each other. It's she's going to be a part of me. And St. John says the same thing about the marriage that he anticipates with her, right? He doesn't want a deacon. He doesn't want a helper to go with him to India. He wants a wife, because a wife, he is totally going to be part of him. A wife is someone who has no place in herself, that is uninfluenceable by her husband. And he and Rochester share this vision of marriage. But Jane does not quite. Jane does not share that vision of marriage, particularly not to someone whose nature is a little bit antipathetic to hers. They both have similar lines, which is really interesting. They both say God sees not as man sees. They both have moments where when St. John says it, it turns out he was a little bit wrong about whether or not Jane was called to be with him. And when Rochester says it, it's when he realizes that judgment has been tempered with mercy. So it's both moments when they're seeing that they have been wrong. But for Rochester, it's a moment of humility, and for St. John, it's I don't understand what is going on. I cannot understand what is going on in that sense. And finally, and this one's really interesting, it just flies right by you, so you might have missed it. Do you all remember that Rochester actually said that when he was really, really, really miserable in the Caribbean, that he thought about killing himself? That he pulls the trunk of guns out, and he sort of thinks about it for a second, but then he says, but not being mad, I didn't do anything. St. John, Rochester says that was the moment of despair, that he was so miserable, that his life had become so much of a living hell, that he thought that he had nothing to fear, that it couldn't possibly get any worse. He didn't actually really believe in hell anyways, and he had no fear of it, because he thought, well, either way, nothing could be worse than this. He contemplates that, but does nothing. St. John too says, I was so intensely miserable, I thought my life must change or I must die. So very similarly, both men, for very different reasons, through mistakes perhaps, are brought to a place where they despair of life. And they look to a solution outside of themselves. The solution that Rochester originally looks to is hope to start again, to find a wonderful woman to spend his life in. He looks for an earthly solution, a replacement wife. The solution that St. John looks for is a replacement career. Weirdly enough, both of those things involve Jane, right? Jane is supposed to be the perfect complement to St. John's career, and also the perfect complement to Rochester. In that sense, although St. John's despair is not alloyed by her, he does somehow attach it to her in ways that you wouldn't have expected. He does somehow attach it to her. That's a little tenuous, but it's interesting. They both were despaired and wanted to die. Now, it's interesting that these two men have all these similarities. It's also interesting to me that where they're different, Rochester looks really bad, and St. John looks really good. So not only are these two men similar, you like parallelism and order in a novel, and that kind of makes sense. Oh, look, let's make them similar so that we can see how much cooler Rochester is. It's actually, for me, mostly the opposite, with one key exception at the very least. Mostly in their differences, Rochester comes off badly, really badly. So the way he's opposite does not usually redound to his credit. So for example, when he's saying to Jane, when they are talking over what to do after Bertha Mason's existence is discovered, she is saying, I'm not going to stay with you. And he says, be careful, Jane. I am not gentle-tempered, long-enduring, or cool. Feel my pulse. See how it beats so wildly. Protect yourself and me. So there's a passionate man who is warning her that if she doesn't act right, he will be carried over the edge. He is not long-suffering, gentle-tempered, or cool. Who is long-suffering, gentle-tempered, and cool? St. John. St. John is very patient and long-suffering. He is extraordinarily gentle-tempered, even when he is very irritated, very mad at Jane. Even then, even though he's cold, he is gentle-tempered. He is long-suffering. He waits and hopes for change. It is completely the opposite. And I don't know about you, but if I were choosing a husband, I kind of would choose that. Someone who is long-suffering. Someone who, even when they're crossed, know how to be gentle, tempered. Of course, what's lacking in St. John then kind of comes to the fore. He's gentle-tempered, but no sympathy. That is hard. But I still think, you're looking at both of them and you're comparing, well, he's this and he's the opposite. St. John wins. He's gentle-tempered, long-suffering, and cool. He would never push someone over the edge through passion, by taking them, by seizing them. Secondly, when Rochester is looking to be saved from the living hell that he finds himself in, the thing that he looks to is earthly pleasure. In two senses, both in the sense that it looks towards earthly satisfactions in family life, the possibility of finding a good woman who's suited to him and who's worth sort of like living with. That's, earthly satisfaction. But ultimately, it doesn't take too long for him to go into the normal forms of earthly pleasures through mostly a mistress, and he tries, dissipation but never debauchery? I keep trying to figure out the difference between those two. They're both D words. It seems that that's a life lived for pleasure, but not in a wild, uncontrolled fashion. So when he is looking to be saved from his earthly hell, it's a self-delivery through the pursuit of pleasure. Does that make sense? When St. John is looking for delivery from despair, it is heavenly delivery through a vocation to serve others. Again, if I were looking for a spouse, I have one already, but if I were looking for a spouse, I would kind of think, well, when the chips are down, I kind of would prefer the guy with a bigger vision than only earthly happiness. Does that make sense? So again, I think Rochester just kind of loses on that front in the place that they're different. St. John manages to transform, to convert everything that's making him miserable into something that benefits others and not himself. But of course, that's what he always wanted to do, but he wanted to do it sort of for self. And he figures out a way, he finds a way to convert that, to transform it. Whereas Rochester finds only a way to displace, to move. And of course he's miserable. Of course he wanders Europe as an outcast. Of course it doesn't work. It's the same move. He has not changed. He's only changed partners in that sense. But he himself has not changed much. So yeah, not redounding to his credit much. The last one, this one kills me. Clearly St. John is an apostle of what does it mean for reason to hold the reins. Anybody read, is it the Phaedrus with the chariot image of the soul? Have you all read that? I forget. So reason, reins, two horses. I know Johnson House reads this. Two horses, appetite and spirit, essentially, or head and belly and chest, etc. Jane actually invokes an image like that with respect to St. John, and talks about how when his heart is bounding and trying to express some of his passionate longing for Rosamond, that she sees the fiery passion, but then she sees the reins on the steed sort of constraining. So she actually gives him, in some sense, a credit for kind of being perfect in the use of reason to restrain a passion that is actually not good. It is not good for him to woo and marry Rosamond. She agrees with him. Jane agrees with him eventually that is not the case when she gets more information about his character. And he rightly restrains it. Now, it says also at the same moment that it's a despotic reign of reason. But it's also proper, it's fitting, it's right. So it's interesting that there's a two-sidedness to his perfection in the rule of reason. It is despotic, but it also is fitting. The other side of it, too, is that he's a hard man who also likes to control. So sometimes he mistakes the dictates of reason for that desire for control, and he doesn't always like he gets his wires crossed, and part of that's a self-knowledge thing. But yeah, so he's like the poster boy, if you like, for reason in the reins. And that's why he's long-suffering, that's why he's cool, right? Because when crossed, what does he do? He prays, he reflects, he thinks, he decides. Yeah. When crossed, what does Rochester do? Stamp his feet, make some noise, like, ah, Jane, Jane. Like, that's the kind of thing that Rochester does. Like, he cries out. Also, and this is what kills me. Rochester says when he's saying to Jane, "You can trust me. You can come live with me, and you can sort of rely on the love that I have for you being faithful and permanent. That you're not just another Fling, you're not another Clara, or another Celine. Is that her name? Celine Varennes? I was thinking Celine Dion. I was like, no. Don't be stupid. Don't get it wrong. They're filming. She doesn't want to be another one of them, and she's trying to sort of say, no, don't worry. Like, I got this. Like, I am totally for you for forever. And what he says is, I should probably read this because this one's great, and it just freaks me out every time. I should have appealed, says Rochester. He basically is apologizing for the whole, lie thing about the wife. I wanted to have you safe before hazarding conferences. This was cowardly. I should have appealed to your nobleness and magnanimity at first, as I do now. I should have opened to you plainly my life of agony, described to you my hunger and thirst after a higher and worthier existence. And here it is, shown to you, not my resolution, that word is weak, but my resistless bent to love faithfully and well, where I am faithfully and well loved in return. Not my resolution, that word is weak. Resolution is a word of the will, is it not? I'm not showing you the strength of my will or my resolution. I'm not making a claim for that. That word is weak. No, the thing that is strong is my bent, my nature, my inclination. Notice just a complete inversion, right, of what St. John says and what mostly people think, right? What would you prefer, a will or a bent? When I start to think about it, I start to worry and think, well, maybe I should prefer the bent, because the bent thing, that's the hard thing to unbend, right? At the very least, it's already over there. On the other hand, to have a man who wants to marry you say that the thing that you should really trust is his nature and not what he promises, not what he can resolve to do in spite of circumstances, ooh, that's scary to me. It's a bit scary. So St. John's the opposite in that sense, right? He is the person whose resolution to love is more strong than his nature, which is to not. Yeah. Yeah, so Rochester really not turning out so great here. Because he's dangerous, right? What we have here, he is hot-tempered, short-suffering. He's looking to earthly things to satisfy perpetually, and he trusts his nature more than his reason or will. That would work better if his nature were perfect. It's like, well, that would work great. But it isn't. It isn't. And he talks about himself being sort of wild. He hasn't been trained properly or pruned properly, whereas St. John talks about his nature being pruned, cultivated a certain direction. All that said, Rochester sympathizes with Jane. With other people, not so much. Right? It's kind of hard to say, well, he really gets human sympathy, because he doesn't. He's kind of like capricious and rude to everybody. including Jane, but she likes it, so it's fine. But he understands the claims of affection, even if he doesn't always act rightly in response to them. Whereas for St. John, it's like a blank. Not only is it like a blank, he doesn't understand by nature claims of affection, but he also refuses to acknowledge them by principle. Because he thinks he has taken too much, I think, to heart the idea that affections are unruly. And instead of taming them and channeling them, he thinks they should have no place, except when it comes to achieving a purpose. Yeah? Because we shouldn't think that he is actually cold in every respect, because he is hot to trot for changing the world. So we cannot say that he is not passionate. Yeah? Does that make sense? We cannot say that, because he is so passionate about achievement that he wants to die when he's moldering in Morehouse and Marsh End. Because his faculties are frustrated. Everything in him that should be a poet or a statesman or a scholar is wasting away. And Jane says the same thing about herself when she's at Lowood. She says that she is restless because her faculties have had no place to really extend and see what they can be and do. She is restless in Marsh End as well. She knows that she could not permanently stay there in her little secluded life, as independent and as honest as it is, and she does live that. Even with the family there, it's not quite enough. Because something about her longs for her faculties to be exercised and not diminished. They are the same. But he thinks that they can only be exercised at the expense of sentiment and affection. Which is why if they married, of course they can converge on the do great things path. This is why to be a missionary with him is attractive. He will do great things. She has the powers to follow him, to do what he asks of him. In fact, she knows that she could impress him, that she has reserves that he has yet to see, and that she would make him approve her, that she would win his approval and his respect and his admiration, which she, in some respects, already has. She knows that, and she can get it. There's something deeply satisfying and attractive about that for her, because she believes that marriage and family life is shut off to her forever. What is not attractive, even though you get some full exercise of faculty there, is to stifle the affections because they are not okay with him. It would be to deny, to submerge, to turn them inward. She calls it to turn it inward into an inward fire that is consuming all of her vitals, because that's what she would have to do. She says that even that she would probably like get a sort of tortured, starving love for him, that she could conceive that happening if she were sort of put with him as his wife, and that he would disdain it because he would regard it as superfluous. Can you imagine being married to someone who, if you loved them, thought that that didn't matter? If you inclined to them with affection, that was a superfluity, that it was just not necessary, and that it would irritate them a bit. That does sound pretty horrible. And Diana's like, whoa, that's really horrible. Who would ever think that that would be good? My brother is weird, but he is a good man. Yeah. So there is something not quite right with him that is very much at odds with her. This is best articulated, I think, and I'll read this to you because it's fun. Let me find it, 468. If you have your book, you can turn, but whatever. It's page 468, and this is when they're in the proposal scene. So many proposals. Let's see. I'll back up just a second. He says of his passion, she says of his passion for Rosamond that it's just too narrow. The kind of man that he is, his nature, is such that he couldn't confine himself to that kind of single passion. What he wants is a passion that exercises greatness, that exercises all of his faculties, his eloquence, his drive, his mastery of men, his ability to lead. That something about the missionary life is something that offers all of those things to him. And when he is telling her, come to India and marry me, and she says, well, I'll come to India, but I'm going to marry you. When he's telling her, well, you know, we'll work on that part. I'm pretty sure that if you think about it this way, you'll agree with me. Simplify your complicated interests, feelings, thoughts, wishes, aims. Merge all considerations into one purpose, that of fulfilling with effect, with power, the mission of your great master. He says, to do that, you need a husband. I don't want a sister. A sister might any day be taken from me. I want a wife. The soul help me. I can influence efficiently in life and retain absolutely till death. I shuddered as he spoke. I felt his influence in my marrow, his hold on my limbs. Seek one elsewhere than in me, St. John. Seek one fitted to you. One fitted to my purpose, you mean? Fitted to my vocation. Again, I tell you, it is not the insignificant private individual, the mere man with the man's selfish senses I wish to mate. It is the missionary. And I will give the missionary, says Jane, my energies. It's all he wants, but not myself. That would only be adding the husk and shell to the kernel. For them, he has no use. I retain them. So St. John sees essentially people through the lens of purpose. He wants to unite with Jane for purpose. She thinks of fitness, though, in terms of people, the little claims that people have on each other. And those are the claims that he's blind to. The fitness of people, mutual sympathy and affection. Natural affection has very little tie on him at all. He loves his sisters in part because he esteems them and because he's used to them. He does love them, though. It's true. It's a true form of affection between them. But that's about it. That's about it. What we have to get, though, about him, so much as there's that flaw of ignoring the claims of little people, is that the thing that is really good about him really is really good. And the book takes that very seriously, and that's why his death can be a triumph. Otherwise, you must read those last two paragraphs as incredible self-delusion. You must read that he's made a horrible mistake, that he's lived his life in vain, and that everything that he thought and thinks is great is actually hollow and empty. You have to basically say Jane wins and he loses. But the claims of justice in the novel that we've seen so far, in which Rochester is the bad guy in so many ways, and St. John is his moral and Christian superior, the book is clear about that as well, it kind of mitigates again. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's very hard for me to swallow at the very end that St. John has to be deluded. At least with respect to the novel as a whole. I'm not too sure what Brontë thinks about it, though. I'm not really sure if it works at the end of the day, if she slapped it on in some sense, or if it's required for the novel to have a coherent vision as a whole. But either way, I think you're meant to really think that St. John's faculties and his exercise of them is great. That he is the missionary version of Julius Caesar. I really think that you're supposed to think that and admire that to the extent that it's admirable. And that we do not tend to admire that. Because we are in more of the position of post-Brontes, post-Romanticism, elevating the sentiments and their exercise and enjoyment above the claims of duty and reason. But Jane does not do that. Jane negotiates a solution in which she is neither a slave to passion or to a wrongly oriented duty that denies her nature. She negotiates neither of this. She negotiates a solution that is neither of those. So something about St. John, though, we have to acknowledge being good, because part of it's in Jane, and also because she praises it over and over again. She calls him great, because he is. So we are called by this novel to, even though the novel is in some ways working the other direction, it's working to sort of make a place for sentiment, for us, that place is king. So it's good for us to hear as well the place for striving, the place for purpose, the place for a greatness that marshals people with and can just do great things. He is right not to marry a woman who would also suppress half his nature. In fact, he makes the same claim. Why can't he marry Rosamond? She's ill-fitted to a missionary wife. Well, you don't have to be a missionary. Yes, I do. I will be a missionary, or I will die because of the stifling of my faculties. I will despair. So my passion for her is not an exercise of my faculties. And isn't that true? That our passions don't by themselves exercise our faculties. The reign of reason that he has, I think you have to sort of see as admirable and heroic to a certain degree, but incomplete. It's not that it's too much, it's that it's not filled also with a right place of natural affection, and it's growing and burgeoning, of accommodating to others without denying reason. You see how it's actually a higher thing to do both than to just do reason? So we're right to criticize that, but we also have to honor it. Otherwise, with Jane, we run the risk of delving into a bathos of sentimentality. We must honor the reign of reason in St. John and the reign of the gospel, at least to the respect, right? I'm not too sure about what he really believes about the gospel. That's a little unclear to me. We have to at least get that he sees the gospel as transforming him away from vice. And ultimately, that being finished with his death. And that's why his death is a triumph, right? His death is the movement of a man who has striven for God for all of his adult life, finally being able to shuffle off that despotism, that hardness, and that coldness, and to enter in both reward and total purgation, to finally become the Christian that he struggles to be. Now, he's very good at being the Christian externally and the man internally, and sometimes James is like, whoa, the Christian, the man, I can forgive the man, and adore, honor, venerate the Christian. And at his highest moments, when he is completely focused and being sort of completely sort of gospel-oriented, she describes him as sublime. The moment when he almost gets her to marry him is because he has been praying for hours about how to save her soul. And he moves with gentleness. He persuades. He reads out, and we're going to look at this in a bit, he reads out Revelation, both the perils of the wicked, but also the promises for the righteous, and says, come with me, come with me. It's that gentleness that draws her and that melts her. And she is saved not because of her reason, although she realizes later it would have been an error of judgment to do what he said without a specific vocation. She's saved because of natural sympathies and affection calling her away. It's very interesting. She's saved for that reason. In that sense, St. John, I think we'll just do 2 more steps, and then we'll start looking at clips. Yay. St. John's, we have to read this, though, because there's so many things we could read. Where is that? Now watch me lose it, not be able to find it. It'll be so sad if I can't find it. Seriously, am I going to lose this? Nature hues. A year ago, I was intensely miserable. That must be it. I should have written nature hues. There it is. No, that's not it. Rats. I always have to lose something when I give a lecture. I forget it. He says, I was trying to remember. He says that, she says, you're just a pagan philosopher at one point, when he talks about how he honors endurance and striving and things like that, and not the passions. He's coming across so stoical that she says, that's just pagan. That's just pagan philosophy. And he says, no, it's Christian philosophy. I have been transformed by the gospel, he says. But he also says, religion has taken the germ, the really tiny, tiny germ of natural affection that I have by nature, the bit that he feels for his sisters and the little bit that he feels for his home, it's taken that and grown it into philanthropy. And the true desire and the will to always act for the good of men around me. That's what his philanthropy is. But it cannot create sympathy. There's no germ. There is no germ in me for sympathy. What religion did is this, but it could not eradicate nature. For that I will have to wait when I shuffle off this mortal coil, is what he says. So religion can develop the seeds of virtue that are crusted over by some of your vices. It can develop them and grow them up bigger than it otherwise would have been, but it cannot so interesting. Religion cannot eradicate nature. And that's why I begin to question, like, what is his notion of the gospel exactly? Because when I think of the power of the gospel to transform, I think of it precisely in terms of the relationship between my nature, my propensities and myself, and the ability to live as Christ did. When I think of the gospel, I don't just think of sins paid for, but I think of spirit-empowered living through union with Christ to truly be transformed. Little by little by little. But St. John puts a cap on what religion can do. In that sense, he sets up a world in which he gives the sort of vision of how do I need to live for the heavens, live for the heavenly alternative if what is presented for me for earthly sort of fruition of my faculties and nature is wrong or narrow or inclining towards vice. Well, then I'll live for heaven. But it's almost just like with the reason thing. It's two separate. He can only live to march the kingdom of heaven forward. But the weird thing is that doesn't seem to be put into Jane's world at all. She says of her feelings for Rochester that she had made him her idol, almost her hope of heaven. And you're like, oh, that's so worrying. And her independence enables her to not treat him like an idol anymore, but you don't get a sense that she has figured out how to live for heaven within the felicity of an earthly family life. She doesn't put the two together either. And I think that's probably a blind spot of Bronte's. That's my current opinion. So in that sense, that's where I think, is this ending where I have to be reminded of both the claims of heaven and the limits of what religion can do to man's nature? With St. John, where he sort of says, yay, I get to die and my master is coming for me and I eagerly await this. It reminds me again of the limits of what religion could do for him and to him, but it also reminds me of the extreme sense in which his and Jane's paths are so divorced. Like either you live for natural sympathies and earthly loves lived out well and virtuously, or you live for the call of heaven. They seem to be really distinct for her. And there's a strange moment where she says, I'm reading this letter where I'm pretty sure he's going to die, and she says she wept human tears. The letter drew from me human tears, but divine joy. And the divine joy I accept. I'm like, oh yeah, divine joy. Yes, he is dying at peace. He is dying exultant and triumphant. Like he kind of lived the life for Christ that he wanted to. Hurrah! And God will approve him. Like she just thinks all these things. God will approve him. So I get the divine joy. It's that she must oppose it to human tears and see them as separate. It's like the provident God only calls you up to strive and to exert yourself and can kind of like adapt and fix your nature a little bit, but he can only get so far until he calls you home. And that where natural affinities and sympathies lie is only in this sort of earthly realm. So it's too divided. And I think, I don't know how to say it yet. I'm not entirely sure what I think about it, but I suspect that there's a problem in Brontë here. That there's a problem with figuring out how to integrate the life of affection and the life of reason, the life of earthly loves, and the life of heavenly loves, and the heavenly call. She seems to give place to both, but I don't know where. And that's why I think St. John's not just a jerk, he's crucial to have a sort of kind of ballast or a weight. He's crucial to having those claims be voiced and aired in the text. He's crucial to reminding us and giving a certain kind of paragon of what reason looks like when, to some degree, perfected, but also the limitations of that kind of perfection. Reason without sentiment. In that sense, he can fall a little bit prey to her judgment of Eliza, that's sort of feeling without, it's judgment without feeling. Okay, so we have, what, about 10 minutes? Wait, what time is it? Holy moly. Wait, I started at 7:30. I have to like 8:45. All right. Ha ha ha. We're going to watch a few clips. I might go a little bit backwards. They're short. There's probably about 10 minutes clips here. So one of the things I noticed, it's very difficult to talk about St. John without beginning to talk about how he's portrayed in film, because that's one of the ways that Jane Eyre has really been popularized or is given modern play. And you can see how his character is going to be very difficult to translate to film. So here's some questions to consider. What are filmmakers trying to do? I think the biggest thing is his offer of like, come with me to India, it has to be compelling. If it doesn't compel, it just ruins that whole part of the book. I'm like, why try? And one of the films just totally gives up on this offer by making him like the vicar of Gateshead, and he like loses his hat in the wind. He looks like a fool. That's the horrible 70s version with George C. Scott. So yeah, how do they try? How do they do it? How do you feel about him? How does his portrayal sort of determines how religion is often portrayed in the movie? Especially with respect to, if he looks too much like Brocklehurst, you have only disdain for what they have to offer. But it always makes the like, Jane might marry him fall totally flat if you do that. It just doesn't work.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.